RadioShack was previously one of the biggest electronic stores in the world. If you wanted to get a new cell or an electronic part, that was your first stop. Right now, that's not the case. Most of you have probably never heard of them, but for those of you who were around some decades ago, you must be wondering where it all went wrong. Before we get to that bit, we should rewind to where it all started. Back in 1921, two brothers in Boston kicked off a company. They sold radio stuff. The name was like today, but it was two words, RadioShack. Nowadays, it's one word, though you might see it as two in some spots. In 1995, they changed their logo to one word. Regardless, the early 20s is when it all began, and things went smoothly for about 40 years after that. The company grew and put up big stores, but in the early 1960s, RadioShack hit a rough patch. They sold radios well, but the money they spent was more than what they made. It just wasn't adding up. Then, this guy named Charles Tandy, who owned a leather company for some reason, stepped in and bought RadioShack. He made big changes, like going to smaller stores. The idea was to figure out what sells best and only sell that. The stuff that did not sell so well got the boot. Getting rid of the less beneficial stuff worked, and along with other changes, it helped the store. In the 1970s, CB radios got trendy, and that was good news for RadioShack. Charles Tandy passed away in 1978, but the Tandy Company still owned RadioShack. In the 1990s, they decided to shift a bit from radio and electronic bits to more popular electronic goods. In the early 2000s, RadioShack changed gears big time. They shifted most of their attention to selling cell phone plans for major phone companies. They partnered up with big names like Verizon, T-Mobile, AT&T, and Sprint. Imagine a store inside a store. They had this setup where they sold phones from a specific carrier to folks walking in. For every phone sold, RadioShack got a commission. And guess what? These commissions were no small change. The deal was sweet because the lifetime value of a customer to a phone carrier could hit thousands of dollars. That is serious cash. Around the same time, they also kicked off an initiative. They interviewed the managers of each of their 5,000 stores. The bottom 1,500 managers, judged by how well their stores were doing, got a heads up. If they didn't boost their store's results in 90 days, they'd be out of a job. Over 1,700 managers faced the axe or got moved to lower roles like sales associates. The firings weren't about how well each manager did on their own. It was all about how they stacked up against each other. If one manager improved, it just meant another would take their spot in the bottom 1,500. This created a sort of crabs in a bucket vibe at the company where everyone was clawing to stay out of the bottom. For a while, this strategy worked out well. In 2005, RadioShack hit a revenue peak at a whopping $5 billion. But here's the catch. Their net profit was only $267 million, giving them a slim 5% net margin. It seemed like success on the surface, but the long-term effects on their corporate culture were not so great. As a phone reseller, RadioShack faced a challenge. They didn't have anything special to stand out. To compete, they had to work with razor-thin profit margins. The hitch in their phone selling plan was the lack of differentiation. They weren't even the ones selling the phones, they just earned commissions from carriers. This meant they had little say in pricing. With the boom of online shopping, the need to visit RadioShack dwindled. Why? You could head straight to the carrier's website and snag a better deal, skipping the commission RadioShack earned. The core issue was that RadioShack didn't bring anything unique to the table. There are no exclusive products or services, and you could find the same stuff cheaper elsewhere. From 2005 onward, things took a downturn for RadioShack. Both their revenue and profitability were in clear decline. To tackle the losses, they aimed to shut down unprofitable stores. While this move would cut their revenue, it also meant less cost and could ease their net losses. However, they had a loan from an asset manager named Sales Capital Partners. The loan terms put a cap on store closures at 200 per year. With over 5,000 stores, that's less than 5% of their total count. Meanwhile, RadioShack's share price was in a free fall. Net losses were piling up, and bankruptcy rumors were gaining steam. It might sound strange that a debt holder would want RadioShack to keep unprofitable stores open. Ideally, you'd think they'd want the company to survive and pay off their debts. But the thing is, Many creditors saw a high chance of RadioShack going bankrupt. They invested in the debt knowing this, with a plan to take control of RadioShack's valuable real estate during the bankruptcy process. By this point, the real estate was worth more than the struggling company itself. Closing more stores would help RadioShack cut losses and stay afloat a bit longer. However, it would also mean reducing the valuable real estate on their balance sheet. And that's what the creditors were really after, the prime real estate that could be more lucrative than the company's operations. With the restriction of closing only 200 stores a year, RadioShack took other measures. They cut the opening hours of their underperforming stores and trimmed staff levels to the bare minimum. However, by 2012, their net losses had surged to hundreds of millions of dollars each year. The situation worsened, and in 2015, their shares were delisted from the New York Stock Exchange. The company market cap had dipped below the minimum threshold of $50 million. Eventually, Standard General swooped in and bought RadioShack out of bankruptcy for $160 million. As part of the bankruptcy proceedings, the majority of their stores were shut down, leaving only 1,700. A once prominent electronics retailer now faced a significantly reduced presence. In a bid to salvage what remained, Standard General partnered with Sprint, leading to co-branded stores as Sprint outlets. At this juncture, RadioShack was a mere shadow of its former self, essentially existing as Sprint stores with a side offering of a few electronic peripherals. Despite this collaboration, the core decline of the business persisted. In 2017, a mere 2 years after the previous bankruptcy, RadioShack found itself in yet another bankruptcy proceeding. This time, the decision was made to liquidate nearly all of their stores, retaining only a handful. With the business hanging by a thread, the remaining workforce faced remarkably low morale. They maintained an e-commerce presence through RadioShack.com, offering headphones, batteries, radios, electronic parts, and even RadioShack-branded apparel. However, for most products, you could often find cheaper alternatives on Amazon or at Walmart. In November 2020, Tai Lopez's company Retail E-commerce Ventures (REV) acquired RadioShack's brand name and e-commerce operations. The purchase price wasn't disclosed, but likely fell in the millions or tens of millions of dollars range, reflecting the significant decline in the business. A once prominent electronics retailer had now transformed into a different chapter under new ownership. Tai Lopez's company Retail E-commerce Ventures (REV) acquired not only RadioShack but also other struggling brands like Pier 1 Imports, Dress Barn, and Linens and Things, among others. The strategy aims to rejuvenate these brands by enhancing their e-commerce capabilities. On the RadioShack website, there's cross-promotion with REV's other e-commerce sites and Tai Lopez's Mentor Box program. Despite the ownership change, the product offerings on the RadioShack website appear largely unchanged. Since REV is not publicly traded, their revenue and profitability remain undisclosed. The challenge lies in catching up with the logistics prowess of giants like Amazon and Walmart, making a successful turnaround for Tai Lopez a hard task. The internet posed a unique challenge for RadioShack, and they felt its impact more than many companies. One significant issue was their belated entry into the online scene. While most stores have embraced online sales over the past 2 decades, RadioShack only caught up about 10 years ago. Missing out on a decade of internet sales coincided with the onset of their troubles. Consider the nature of RadioShack's products: electronic parts, resistors, wires, and fuses, items easily ordered online without the need for a physical inspection. This made their product line ideal for online sales. Additionally, RadioShack's relatively small size meant uncertainty in stocking specific parts. On the internet, the odds of finding what you need are nearly guaranteed. Contrary to expectations, walking into a RadioShack resembled a different experience. Instead of the variety found in larger electronic stores, it often felt more like a diet Best Buy or a low-calorie version. The store lacked the appeal of new tech gadgets, leaving customers with limited reasons to shop there. Despite the convenience of quicker access, buying from RadioShack instead of online seemed less enticing. The internet presented a perfect outlet for RadioShack, especially for their product range. However, they missed this opportunity for years, and the consequences were evident in the challenges they faced. Now they're struggling to keep up with others. Do you think they will be a big name in e-commerce? Let me know in the comments. Please make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more content.